Imagine for a moment that it's your wedding night in the year 1400. Your new spouse is waiting for you in the bedroom. You're in the mood for intimacy, but you have about 14 days to study the 847-page manual published by the church, detailing exactly what you can and cannot do in bed. Because as it turns out, in the medieval world, having sex wasn't simply an act between two people, it was a religious procedure, regulated more strictly than a papal ceremony, where every position, every moment, and every thought was cataloged as either holy or sinful. Welcome to the world of medieval sex, where the Catholic Church had turned the most intimate act of human experience into a legal code so complex that you needed a theologian to navigate a romantic night without accidentally condemning yourself to eternal hell. Today we're going to explore one of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of medieval life, the 5 sexual acts that the Church not only permitted but actively encouraged, and the 5 acts it considered so sinful that they could result in excommunication, torture, and death. A system of sexual regulation so detailed and controlling that marital sex felt like walking through a moral minefield where one wrong step could destroy your soul for eternity. Get ready to discover why medieval confessors needed specialized manuals to interrogate couples about their intimate lives. Why was making love to your own husband on certain days of the year considered a serious crime? And why did sexual positions have such specific moral classifications that theologians debated for hours over the relative sanctity of different angles of penetration? Because after this story, you'll understand why medieval sexual repression not only controlled bodies but shaped entire societies through the most elaborate intimate terror ever conceived by a religious institution. Let's start with something that will completely change your perspective on medieval marriage. The 5 sexual acts that the Church not only permitted, but considered marital virtues that guaranteed the salvation of the soul and divine favor. But here's the part that will blow your mind. These permitted acts were so restrictive and specific that they turned marital sex into a completely mechanical and dehumanized experience. First permitted act, the pure procreative act. The only form of sex fully approved by the Church was what they called the pure procreative act missionary position, in total darkness, with the sole purpose of procreating, performed without pleasure for either spouse and completed as quickly as possible to minimize time spent on sinful flesh. Marital manuals specified that the man should penetrate his wife with solemn procreative purpose, without foreplay, passionate kissing, or any movement that could be interpreted as seeking pleasure. The woman was to remain completely passive with her eyes closed, praying throughout the act to sanctify the reproductive process. Records from the Archbishopric of Canterbury contain letters where confessors praised couples who had managed to conceive without sin through this method. A letter from 1456 congratulates a noble couple for fulfilling their procreative duty with such purity that neither the man nor the woman experienced carnal corruption during the conception of their heir. But here's what will truly terrify you: this act had to be documented. Couples were required to confess the specific details of each sexual encounter to their confessors, who kept detailed records to ensure the purity of the procreative act was maintained. The archives of Toledo Cathedral contain thousands of these intimate records, documenting not only the frequency, but also the exact duration, words spoken, and level of pleasure experienced. Second permitted act, the sacred marital debt. The Church recognized that spouses had the right to demand sex from their partners to prevent adultery, but this marital debt had such specific rules that it turned intimacy into a legal transaction. The spouse owing the debt had to comply with holy obedience, while the spouse demanding it had to do so with divine authority. Manuals specified that a woman who refused the marital debt committed a mortal sin, but a man who demanded it outside of permitted days also sinned mortally. There were official calendars marking exactly when the marital debt could be exercised: never on Sundays, never during Lent, never during Advent, never on major saints' days, and never during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. Records from the Las Huelgas convent document a case where a woman was excommunicated for denying the marital debt on a technically permitted day, while her husband was punished with penance for demanding it using words that showed carnal lust instead of holy marital authority. Third permitted act, correction of infertility. When a couple could not conceive after a year of marriage, the Church allowed specific modifications to the sexual act to correct divine infertility. These modifications included slightly altered positions, specific times based on lunar cycles, and the incorporation of special prayers during the act. Medical records from the time show that these methods were developed by theologians in consultation with Christian doctors who combined rudimentary medical theory with religious doctrine. The result was sexual procedures so complicated that they required prior preparation and confessional supervision. Fourth permitted act, the remedy against lust. The church recognized that total abstinence could lead to greater sins like adultery or masturbation. So it allowed limited marital sex as a spiritual medicine against these sins. But this medicinal sex had to be preceded by confession, followed by penance and performed with the least possible satisfaction. Couples using sex as a remedy against lust had to report to their confessors if they experienced pleasure and received additional penances proportional to the level of satisfaction reported. Fifth permitted act, sacramental union in illness. When one spouse was gravely ill and near death, the church allowed a final sexual act called the sacramental union in illness. This act was considered so sacred that it had to be witnessed by a priest to ensure it was performed with purity and holy purpose. Parish records contain dozens of cases where couples performed this final sexual act under direct clerical supervision with specific prayers in the understanding that it was a terrestrial farewell before eternal separation. Now, if you find this ecclesiastical regulation of marital intimacy as fascinating as it is disturbing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more revelations about how religious institutions controlled every aspect of medieval private life. But if the permitted acts were restrictive to the point of dehumanization, wait until you discover the prohibited acts that could result in torture, death, and eternal damnation. Because the medieval church wasn't content with regulating permitted sex, it had created a taxonomy of sexual sin so detailed that it included acts most modern people would consider completely normal and harmless. First, prohibited act, sex for pleasure. The most severely punished sexual act in the medieval world was having sex with your own spouse for the sole purpose of pleasure. This included any act that lasted longer than necessary for conception, any position that could intensify sensations, any caress not strictly necessary for penetration, and any expression of enjoyment during the act. Confessional manuals contain specific questions designed to detect marital lust. Did you last longer than necessary? Did you touch unnecessary parts? Did you experience pleasure during the act? Did you desire to continue after ejaculation? Affirmative answers resulted in penances that could last years. Records from the Spanish Inquisition document cases where married couples were tortured for confessing to having sex for carnal love rather than procreative duty. In 1487, a couple in Seville was subjected to public torture because the husband confessed to enjoying his wife more than was appropriate for a devout Christian. The treatise Summa Confessorum specified that sex for pleasure was equivalent to adultery in terms of moral gravity because it turned the marital bed into a brothel and profaned the sacrament of marriage. Couples guilty of this sin faced temporary excommunication and public penances and forced separation for periods that could extend for years. Second, prohibited act, any non-missionary position. The church had determined that only one sexual position was morally acceptable. Man on top, woman on bottom, face-to-face with no variations. Any other position was considered unnatural and resulted in accusations of bestiality, sodomy, or demonic possession. Judicial records are full of cases where couples were arrested for unnatural acts that turned out to be simply alternative sexual positions. The position with the woman on top was considered especially sinful because it inverted the divine order and allowed the woman to usurp male authority. In 1453, the records of the Paris Ecclesiastical Court document the case of a couple condemned to death for marital sodomy after confessing to using positions where the man penetrated the woman from behind. They were publicly executed as a warning to other couples about the consequences of sinful sexual innovation. Theologians had developed elaborate theories about why certain positions were sinful. The side position confused gender roles. The standing position profaned the marital bed, and any position allowing deeper penetration demonstrated excessive lust. Third, prohibited act, any form of oral sex. Any oral contact with genitals was considered one of the gravest possible sins, equivalent to blasphemy and heresy. This included not only explicit oral sex, but also kisses on impure areas of the body, defined as anything below the navel. Confessional manuals contain specific warnings about impure kisses, and required confessors to ask detailed questions about any oral contact. Penances for oral sex were harsher than those for some types of murder because it was believed to corrupt both the soul and the body in irreversible ways. Inquisition records contain cases where people were tortured to death for confessing acts of marital oral sex. In 1478, a woman in Toledo was burned alive for admitting to placing her mouth on her husband's private parts during what she described as a moment of conjugal love. Fourth, prohibited act sex on prohibited days. The church had established that approximately 180 days of the year were completely forbidden for any sexual activity, even between married couples. These days included all Sundays, all of Lent, all of Advent, all religious holidays, all fasting days, and additional periods based on the lunar calendar. Couples who had sex on prohibited days faced penances that could include prolonged fasting, forced pilgrimages, temporary marital separation, and in extreme cases, annulment of the marriage. Confessors kept detailed calendars and interrogated couples about the exact dates of each sexual encounter. Parish records show that many couples lived in constant terror of accidentally violating temporal prohibitions. A letter from 1489 describes a woman who carried a special rosary with color-coded beads to remember which days were safe for marital intimacy. Fifth, prohibited act individual or mutual masturbation. Masturbation was considered one of the gravest possible sins, worse than adultery, because it wasted divine seed without procreative purpose. This included both individual masturbation and any form of mutual manual stimulation between spouses. Confessors were trained to detect physical signs of masturbation and ask specific questions designed to extract confessions. Confessional manuals contained graphic descriptions of masturbatory acts to ensure penitents understood exactly what was forbidden. Penances for masturbation were so severe that they frequently resulted in death by starvation during penitential fasts. Medical records from the time document cases of people who died fulfilling penances for solitary sins, particularly young people who confessed to masturbation during adolescence. And if you feel overwhelmed by the complexity and cruelty of this total sexual control system, definitely subscribe for more revelations about how religious institutions turned human intimacy into a moral battlefield. But here we come to the most disturbing part of this entire story: the system of surveillance and punishment the church had established to ensure compliance with these sexual regulations, because it wasn't enough to set the rules. They had to ensure compliance through methods of intimate espionage that would make a modern police state seem respectful of privacy. Confessors had detailed manuals specifying exactly what questions to ask to extract information about their parishioners' sexual lives. These questions were so specific and graphic that the manuals came with warnings about how to ask them without corrupting the confessor in the process. The Confessional Manual of 1486 contains over 200 specific questions about sexual activity, including details about frequency, duration, positions, levels of pleasure thoughts during the act, and physical sensations experienced. Confessors were required to ask these questions to all married adults during the mandatory annual confession, but the system went beyond confession. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious sexual activity they might observe or hear. Servants had specific instructions about what to watch for in their employers' beds. Innkeepers had to report inappropriate sounds from the rooms of married guests. Judicial records show cases where couples were arrested based solely on neighbors' reports of sounds that lasted too long or bed movements suggesting excessive lust. Marital intimacy had effectively been turned into a public act subject to constant community supervision. Penances for sexual violations weren't just additional prayers. They included fasts that could last months, forced pilgrimages to dangerous destinations, mandatory marital separation, public corporal punishment, and in extreme cases, permanent branding or mutilation. Records from the Burgos Diocesan Archive document the case of a couple forced to live apart for 3 years for confessing to having sex too frequently during their first year of marriage. Their children were placed under ecclesiastical custody during this period to protect them from the influence of lustful parents. But perhaps the most devastating impact was the psychological toll of living under this system of total sexual control. Couples developed terror of their own sexuality, chronic anxiety about every aspect of their intimate lives, and frequently complete sexual dysfunction caused by constant fear of punishment. Personal diaries from the time reveal marriages destroyed by sexual paranoia. A noblewoman wrote in 1467, "My husband and I lie down each night as terrified strangers, counting every movement, timing every moment, wondering if what we feel is holy love or damnable lust. We have turned our marital bed into a chamber of psychological torture, where pleasure is evidence of sin and coldness is evidence of virtue." The effects of this system extended far beyond individual couples. Entire generations grew up with completely distorted concepts of sexuality, intimacy, and love. Systematic sexual repression created societies where cruelty was normalized. Authoritarian control was accepted as natural, and basic humanity was considered suspicious. Historical studies show direct correlations between the intensity of religious sexual repression and the prevalence of social violence, civil wars, and authoritarian political systems. Societies that most strictly regulated private sexuality also tended to be the most brutal in their public policies. And here we come to the most important reflection of this entire exploration. This medieval sexual control system wasn't just about sex, it was about total power, the power of an institution to control the most intimate and private aspects of human experience. By regulating every aspect of marital sexuality, the Church had achieved something no political government had attempted before: total control over the private lives of every individual. If an institution could dictate how, when, and why people could be intimate with their own spouses, then there were no limits to its authority. This sexual control was the foundation of all other social controls. A population that had learned to repress its most basic instincts out of fear of divine punishment was a population that could be controlled in any way the religious authority deemed fit. Historical records show that societies with the greatest sexual repression also had greater political obedience, greater acceptance of social inequality, and less resistance to authoritarian policies. Sexual control was the ultimate tool of social control. So there you have it, 5 sexual acts that the medieval Church permitted under such restrictive conditions that they turned intimacy into a medical procedure, and 5 acts it prohibited so severely that their practice could result in torture and death, a system of sexual regulation so total and invasive that it made private life impossible and genuine intimacy an act of rebellion. This wasn't just a system of religious morality, it was a massive experiment in social control through sexual repression designed to create populations completely submissive to institutional authority through intimate terror. The next time someone speaks nostalgically about traditional values or the morality of the past, remember that those values included systems of sexual control that turned marital love into a legal transaction subject to constant supervision and brutal punishment. Remember that the sexual freedom we take for granted today, the ability to be intimate with our partners without fear of religious punishment, was won through centuries of struggle against institutions that considered human pleasure evidence of moral corruption. And remember that protecting these intimate freedoms requires constant vigilance, because history shows us that authoritarian institutions always seek to control sexuality first as a way to establish total control over human life. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I can be intimate with my partner without having to consult a theological manual, without timing the duration to avoid eternal damnation, and without worrying that my neighbors will report my inappropriate sounds to the religious authorities. Because after diving into this historical nightmare of institutionalized sexual control, I think we can all be deeply grateful to live in an era where intimacy is a private right, not a public act subject to detailed religious regulation. And if you made it to the end of this disturbing yet enlightening revelation about medieval sexual control, let us know in the comments from which country you're following us. We're fascinated to know that these truths about the historical regulation of human intimacy are reaching people worldwide who value as much as we do the importance of protecting personal freedom against authoritarian institutional control.